Good morning and welcome from Erfurt, Germany. I am Tristan Kruger and I'm talking to Pirje. Prost.
Prost.
Yes, we are here to talk about the liturgy from two different sides of the world right now, because I'm doing my internship in Germany and Pirje is still in South Africa doing his internship there as a pastor. And yeah, we have been thinking a lot more about the liturgy. I've been seeing some beautiful churches here in Erfurt, beautiful old churches, and definitely already hearing and learning new ways in which you can actually perform or lead a church service. And today we also thought we could make it a bit broader, talk more about liturgy and church service or the divine service in general, because last week we might have gone on a few tangents that only we understand and a certain few others. But without too much introduction, I want to give over to Pirje and ask about his perspective of the liturgy and how he maybe understands the liturgy.
Thank you, Tristan. Yeah, just a little footnote. You can see we're coming to you from different sides of the world, given my short-sleeved tropical shirt, and Tristan is in his in his jacket, and you even look a little more pale.
Pale.
So okay,
yeah, it is cloudy today. Yeah.
But one of the things that obviously does unite us, even over all of the distance, is our common liturgy. Us both being now interns for pastors in the Lutheran Church, or technically, I think our title should be like almost pastors or pastors in training. That's what the youth at the school call me, almost Pastor PJ. But yes, as Lutheran interns, what unites us, and especially in this conversation now, is our common liturgy, which looks a bit different from place to place, but which also has just enough similarity, regardless of context, to be able to function as a common form or expression of worship. And regarding the question, what is the liturgy? As we mentioned last time, I think the liturgy, in one sense, is just the basic form and structure of the worship service. One could say specifically the Sunday worship service, but it flows over into so many other aspects of life as well. It can even be applied to your morning and evening prayers, your table prayers. Basically, all forms of Christian worship, as it's expressed corporately, like in a common body of believers, takes on certain forms. There's a certain order to it, and that order we call the liturgy. Now, I think we mentioned it. We might have mentioned it last time, but repetition does our memories very well. It comes from the Greek word liturgios, which is a compound from two different words that mean the work of the people, or it could also be translated as a public service. So in ancient Greece, if you were a citizen of the city-state, then you could sponsor some sort of a ceremony or a service which is open to the entire public and which is for the good of the entire city as well. Sometimes religious, sometimes not necessarily religious, but from there we have our word. It's a work of the people, or otherwise contrived, it's a work of God for the people. And somehow both those, even though there's like a little bit of a contrast there, I think both of them have a place, because obviously in the liturgy, we do certain things and God does certain things. And the interplay between the work of God's people and the work of God himself, I think that I would regard as the Christian liturgy. Yes.
Yeah, Thank you very much. I actually forgot about that definition of liturgia or liturgia. Yeah, I should recap my Greek. But yeah, that was a much more detailed definition than mine the last time.
Oh, no,
Uh,
no.
so I'm very happy about that. Yeah, so as I'm now speaking, I'm thinking of the South African context again,
Hmm.
and where we definitely have some traditional liturgies yet still, traditional forms of worship. Um, and maybe, yeah, you can tell us a bit more about like what what the structure is, the broad structure of the liturgy.
Yes, I think that would be quite cool. So, as mentioned, there's a lot of commonality between how the Sunday worship service looks way down south here in the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran churches, um, and with how it looks over there way up north by you guys. But now, uh, one might think that, okay, perhaps that's because the Lutheran church is down south, or like our Lutheran church has a German heritage. And because Tristan is now in Germany with the German Lutheran church, obviously it's going to look similar. But I would say one shouldn't be too quick to think it's just a cultural thing. So much of the way our liturgies are structured, as we mentioned in the previous episode, come from so long ago, from an ancient Roman, Greek, Mediterranean context, multicultural context, that you really can't say what makes it similar from South African to a German perspective is the fact that it's German, or the fact that there was German missionaries that brought it here. No, there's a much older root, I think, which binds us together, and the more cultural elements, I think, like the fact that Scandinavian Lutheran liturgies look a little bit different to German Lutheran liturgies, which look a little bit different to North American Lutheran liturgies. That's more a product of culture. It's like each of our little cultures and contexts tweaks it in
Mhm.
this way or that. But the greatest source of similarity comes from the fact that we've got this shared liturgical tradition in the very earliest forms of Christian worship. And as to how it's structured, perhaps I can give a little bit more of a general outline. In the early church, well, obviously we see some proto liturgies or some very early embryonic liturgies already in the New Testament. But then, as the early church develops, and we have the Great Council of Nicaea, and it begins spreading into the empire, and the churches also get more elaborate. Um, the church suddenly has the luxury, you could say, having survived a few centuries of persecution, to develop more elaborately the Christian worship service. And traditionally, it would then be split in two. You can distinguish any classical Christian liturgy between the service of the word and the service of the sacraments. Um, and the service of the word, then obviously the climax there would be the sermon. But there's so much else going on there. It's the readings from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, from the Psalms. There's an entire preparatory service like of confession and absolution, which tries to prepare our hearts for hearing God's word and responding to it. And that all falls in the former portion of the worship service, which, funnily enough, in olden times, was also completely open to the public. Whether you've been a baptized Christian, whether you've been catechized, you are welcome to the liturgy of the word. It's open, it's for everybody. But that then was
Mm.
distinguished from the liturgy of the sacrament,
Yeah.
which was in the earliest times reserved exclusively for the catechized. So those individuals who, if they were born into Christian families, they would be baptized, and at a very young age, they would make their confession of faith, and then be allowed to partake of Holy Communion, or of the sacrament.
Mm.
But then, given that in the beginning, many Christians were converts from other religions, they would first have to go through quite a prolonged period of catechesis or religious instruction, after which they would be baptized, usually here around Easter. And then they would be allowed to also join the second part of the liturgy, or the liturgy of the sacrament, which
Yeah.
climaxes in Holy Communion. And that's a very bare bones division of classical liturgical Christian worship. You've got
Mm,
the
mm.
service of the word and the service of the sacrament, and then these two are colored in the most beautiful and wondrous way by
Yes.
various elements.
Colored in and symbolized, or yeah, we have those symbols in our
Mhm.
church already.
Yes.
The baptismal font on the left for the listeners watching, and the pulpit on the right, and in the middle you've got the cross and the altar, the Lord's
Mm.
table.
The Lord's table.
And yeah, as I understand it, it's also a very actually a very beautiful way of showing how our life of faith is also sometimes formed. That we start with baptism, are born new with Christ, and then as we go move our vision to the Lord's table, that is where we gather as a community, as a community of Christ, of people who are baptized in the name of God, and then the pulpit where the word of God is then also preached, and there we also have that combination between, yeah, the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the sacrament. I hope I understood that correctly.
Yes, yes, definitely. I think you
Yeah.
elaborated on it beautifully as well. And as you were describing it, I was thinking also of perhaps some later developments. So if you look at churches of the Reformation, for instance, if perhaps you're more familiar with the Reformed tradition, um, and you contrast it to the Lutheran tradition, you can even see these different emphases on the highlights, or the how could you say, the climax of the service, just in where everything is arranged. Like in Reformed churches, the pulpit is front and
Yeah.
center, and
Yes.
the preaching of the word is very much the highlight of the service.
Mm.
Whereas in Lutheran churches, you see a very clear different arrangement. Right in the center is the altar, with obviously, yes, the cross, actually two crosses. A pastor of ours had a beautiful elaboration on the symbolism of that. Perhaps we have time in a bit to talk about that.
Mm.
But in the middle, you've got the altar where Holy Communion is instituted, and around which this common table, people from the right side of the congregation and the left side and way down at the
Yes,
back
yes.
come together, are drawn together by Christ. And then off to the side, you have the pulpit where the pastor preaches the word of God.
Mhm.
So, yeah, one sees the logic. How could one say about one sees the logic of the service also in the architecture, which is quite cool.
Yes, we do. And that obviously you can see even more in Europe, I would say, with
Mm.
the old church buildings that often have, yeah, beautiful windows and well, the ones I've seen here
Mm.
also some works of art, depictions of certain um, characters or important moments. Of course, in the Catholic Church or the Roman Catholic Church, you get a lot more pictures and visual stuff that
Statues.
shows you. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm.
And in the Orthodox Church, you also get icons and so on.
Mm.
But yeah, maybe a discussion for another day. The thing I just want to focus on maybe is why it's also important, why all of these things are important, and why this discussion is important. And I would start off by saying that the fact of the matter is that we do want people to come to church, of course. We
Hmm.
want people to come to the church service and celebrate and worship with one another. Um, and yeah, there is of course this trend now in Europe, but I think also in South Africa that the mainline churches, or yeah, traditional mainline churches, are losing young people.
Mhm.
And I think a discussion of the liturgy is especially important for young people, even for me as well, to understand how can we make it vibrant for uh, for people to feel like they're being recuperated or reinvigorated for
Yes.
the week. Because in our last video we talked about how the church service is obviously at the beginning of the week on a Sunday, so that it actually gives you some therapy basically, or some way of healing for the next week
Mm.
and preparing for the next week. But I've actually heard, unfortunately, sometimes that people don't quite have that experience in various churches, but that when the liturgy and especially the traditions aren't alive anymore, and they can't really sense
Mm.
that there's something spiritual there, then maybe we have to think about how can we allow people to experience God's presence profoundly in the
Yes.
liturgy.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I think that brings us to the crux of the matter.
Yeah.
Um, and perhaps my first reaction would be that there's probably a two-part. Well, there's probably quite a lot going on in the absence of young people from more traditional worship
Mm.
services. But two things that strike me immediately, mm, just from personal experience, is one, I think a part of it might be put down to rather watered down catechesis, and in some cases, downright bad religious instruction from a young age. In that, I think what goes on in the liturgy, what goes on in the church service, is sometimes remains to lifelong Lutherans a mystery. A not well. For it to be a mystery is one thing, meaning
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that you can't fully comprehend. That's fine, but
Mm.
what I'm actually trying to get at is it remains a dark cloud of uncertainty, and
Yes,
I want
yes.
to use the hard word ignorance, in
Yeah.
that sometimes the questions just aren't put forth, or where they are put forth, they might be answered haphazardly. It's
Yeah.
the age
Yeah.
old tale of becoming over familiar with things that you've known your whole life, and then
Yes.
just losing
Yes.
losing sight of what it means.
So then how do you actually make it alive again? Make it something special for you and
Mm.
not familiar. Yeah.
And I think they're the second part. So the first part I think is uh, it, somewhat individual. You look at the individual who does not necessarily know what's going on there, and accordingly doesn't see the relevance of it. But the other part is how it is presented, and how
Mm.
it is how what does happen there is facilitated. So
Yeah.
I think, and there I would point more to the clergy and to the church and our higher structures, and to pastors, to and
Mm.
pastors in training. I think
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
we make it downright difficult for people, unnecessarily difficult for people to experience something of the grace which God is serving us with in the service
Yes.
by
Yes.
bad preaching. And I don't mean bad preaching in the sense that this wasn't an artwork. No, I mean
Yeah.
preaching that does
Yeah, yeah.
not do the essential work of just showing us our sin, showing us our brokenness and our need for healing,
Mhm.
and then showing us our, well, proclaiming the words of healing of our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, that what
Yeah.
we in the Lutheran Church call law gospel. I think that you find, I have found that very well, far too seldom. Even
Yeah.
having attended Lutheran churches for quite some time now.
Yes.
So that would be one reaction. Um, but then the other reaction, or the other thing is, you know, I think we have to find new ways of capitalizing on the sheer beauty of our worship. If I
Mhm.
have to paint this
Yes.
in a very broad brush, you look at some of the best and most beautiful, most attractive uh, pieces of classical music. I'm reminded of Johann Sebastian Bach's Johannes Passion or Matthäus Passion,
Mhm.
which is
Yes.
basically just a an Easter service, or a Good Friday service. And
Mhm.
that was never meant to be performed in some hall or some church for a bunch of music aficionados. That was to be heard by the people of God. And you can
Yes.
go anywhere in this world currently, um, and see whenever that piece of music by Bach is performed, whenever that church service is performed by musicians, then wherever it is being done, the place is chock full.
Yeah.
But a week later, if you go to a Good Friday service, you find people being rather absent. So I think we've lost something of the the art of using the beauty of our faith and bringing it to bear in our services. I think we can rediscover something.
Yes, yes. And this brings me to the topic that we have actually done in both of our theses, I think, is this idea of modernity or post-modernity actually influencing our culture so much that when we go to a church service, we feel so far removed from this atmosphere. The atmosphere that we experience in the church is so different from what we actually now experience on the outside that it doesn't, it just doesn't fit into our life anymore. That's at least how I have even experienced it sometimes. Um, and yeah, I mean, your thesis, I think, was also a bit about, how we've gone from traditional mindsets, or a traditional mindset in our cultures, to a more modern mindset where we've lost the sense of the sacred, right? Something like that.
Indeed.
Yeah, of meaningfulness.
Yes, yes. Oh goodness. I I very much look forward to elaborating on that specific point, perhaps in the part two of
Yes.
of this discussion. But I first want to link into something that you've just mentioned, um, regarding well, it sounded like the the experience for young people often coming to church is that it's a
Mm.
visit to a foreign country, or
Yes.
a or a visit, even worse, it's like a time
Yeah,
traveling
yeah, yeah.
expedition. And unfortunately, not too far
Exactly.
back in the past. It's just like to your
Exactly.
grandparents' generation.
Yes.
um, but it is also, to a large extent, for many young people, I think, uh, an exercise or an expedition into the unknown, which doesn't
Mm.
become more familiar or become more known. There's strange language which doesn't immediately make sense to us. Language
Yeah.
of sin and forgiveness,
Mm.
language of guilt and grace. Which, I mean,
Mm.
we've grown up with this. We've heard all of the Bible stories, perhaps, but I think something central has gotten lost regarding the significance of those words. And given that, our our participation in the service sometimes might seem to us to be senseless or even artificial.
Mhm.
And we know this, that for younger generations, there is scarcely a greater sin than that of inauthenticity or of
Yeah.
artificiality.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
but it does tie into larger societal developments, and yeah, perhaps we can discuss this in due course. I just wanted to throw
Yeah.
the ball back in your court real quick. Um, we mentioned in the previous discussion this underlying tension between more contemporary forms of worship and more traditional forms of worship. And I mean, now you are there in Germany in these beautiful old churches, and I would guess in a context where mm, the old architecture of the buildings also is often accompanied by old forms of the liturgy and traditional forms of the church service, and
Mm.
perhaps also far too often uh, empty or rather empty churches.
Mm.
Um, I've experienced something of that at the congregation that I am now. It's Lutheran. It's got a Lutheran liturgy, but in a very much contemporary form. And I remember in the beginning being quite uncomfortable with this. And then after a while, when people would ask, "Well, how do you adapt with this modern liturgy and upbeat music?" And I say,
Yeah.
"Well, you know what? To be honest, it's not my first preference, but I take it any day, given the fact that there's a full church in
Mm.
attendance."
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
I don't know how it is in your experience thus far.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been in a church service yet because
Oh,
I only
okay.
arrived on Sunday afternoon.
Okay.
But
Okay. Okay.
even still, I've actually driven past the churches in the train and then had these really strange and unique and even I would say mystical experiences of actually like thinking I'm really now driving in this really modern transport service, and yet seeing this old architecture like a statue of Martin Luther or a big gray church, and then I just think like it's actually a beautiful mix of different times of different eras or yeah um and I'm not sure quite what to make of it yet, but
Yes.
there's
Okay.
definitely something there for me to
Ponder.
think about. And yes, I've already heard the churches are usually only filled with older people
Mm,
and not young people because, uh, for example, I heard someone saying it all just feels like they're too holy, you know. When they
mm,
go to church, they're supposed to be really, you know, doing
mm,
everything right, and there's this language of holiness, you know, that they just can't associate with,
mm,
because, as you said, authenticity is this big thing. Even though we have now this era of social media where authenticity is a very
exactly.
questionable thing. I I do think actually young people are looking for authenticity in
Mm,
church services, and I think in those services where they do find it, like a pastor being really honest with them or
mm,
actually using language that they're also using, like not necessarily talking about sin, but maybe about, you know, separation from God or anxiety or
mm.
fear and maybe some deeper yeah emotions and experiences. There, young people actually really feel like they're being re re-encouraged for the week because yeah because it's authentic. Maybe that's why I also linked this discussion now with, oh, I see the time. I linked the discussion with the problem in society as well, as just because there's this authenticity, I think, between the the really public, modern, secular sphere and the really religious, holy, uh, 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 sinless
Oh,
church. No,
and how
I'm just
un-Lutheran.
exaggerating. Yeah,
Yeah, no,
exactly. But
but
that's the thing.
exactly.
It's like you would think people wouldn't experience that in a Lutheran church,
Mm,
and yet that's what I hear. Because yeah, so maybe we should exactly take a look at the liturgy again as we
mm,
are doing now, and see where are we maybe actually being inauthentic.
yes.
I think that's a question that I've now formed from the discussion, and how why I would say it's a very important discussion. This about the liturgy. It's actually about authenticity.
And I think it's one that we would probably be taking up sooner than you think. But perhaps for
Yeah,
now, given the
yeah.
time, we will.
We didn't even
We
realize.
didn't even
Sorry.
realize this. Yeah, this was we must timer must be broken.
Yeah,
But okay, for now, signing out.
exactly. Please leave your comments on the discussion here. We love engaging, as you see. And until the next video, please be ready for the next one because it could well be a different conversation partner joining Pierre here. Goodbye.
Goodbye.